Hey guys, how are you doing?
Hey, Andy.
It's very good to see you both. We're starting our videos just by asking our contributors to introduce themselves and to give us an overview of their work. So may I ask you to do that, please?
Matt, would you like to go first?
Okay, my name is Matthew Steggle. I'm Professor of Early Modern English Literature at the University of Bristol. I've been in the trade for about 25 years and I've done all sorts of different things, scholarly editions, monographs, but over the last 10 years or so I've been particularly interested in lost plays.
Thank you.
And that's kind of where I come in. I'm David McInnis. I'm Associate Professor of Shakespeare and Early Modern Drama at the University of Melbourne in Australia. It's not really this bright in the background right now. It's 9 o'clock at night, so I'm just going to confess right from the outset, but I did want to at least let you look at Australia whilst we're talking. So my research has been largely theatre history related, to do with lost plays, as Matt suggested, and that's the capacity in which we've known each other for many years now, collaborating on Lost Plays database and various spin-off projects. But I also have an interest in voyage drama or early modern travel too. So imagination and things that have been lost in a slightly different way, I guess. A lack of access, a lack of mobility, but the technology that makes travel and visiting other parts of the world and people possible. So my research interest is eerily coming into relevance at present.
Yeah, definitely. I think many of us have been feeling that in lots of different and unexpected ways. So bearing in mind that we're pitching these films at anyone who might want to watch them, I guess I want to start by a question which might seem horrifyingly obtuse to both of you, but what is a lost play? Sorry.
David.
Well, it's a good question. So it's something that we do have to clarify quite often, and our thinking on it has changed too. So Matt and I have been working together with Rosalind Knudsen for the last 10 or more years now, thinking about lost plays. And it rapidly became apparent that lostness is really a spectrum rather than a single sort of binary on-off kind of a situation. And I think that's encapsulated in the fact that when we first started talking 10 years ago or so, to us, a lost play was something that we had a hope of recovering a script for, and it was really lost in terms of textuality. The fact that you didn't have a play script to read was the defining feature of what was lost. But as the decade wore on, I think we've been thinking more and more about things, elements that have been lost from plays, even about plays that we might consider to be fully existing today, but performances of them or alternative versions of them have been lost. And so I think the most exciting thing that we've come across really, and Matt might correct me, is just how much the ground beneath our feet is quite fragile, really. We're this increased awareness of just how lost everything can be and how it can always slip through your fingers.
Thank you. Matt, did you want to add anything?
Yeah. I mean that was absolutely the start. David and Ros published the list of known lost plays, and I remember looking at them thinking, I've never heard of. There's hundreds of plays here, and we've not heard of them, and yet we can describe them to some extent. We can say a bit about them from their title, and often from other sorts of records. So Henslow's Diary, which is a sort of account book, sort of kept by the sort of theatrical entrepreneur Henslow. It's got all sorts of information about the props and the takings and all sorts of other aspects that are actually missing for the plays that we like to think are extant. We like to think we have. And the more you looked at it, the more you thought, as you say, that this is more complicated than just a simple alive and extinct thing. There's a whole gradation of sorts of evidence about I guess performance culture in all sorts of senses. Obviously, popular culture is a thing that you two are interested in, and it's much more, much less clear cut than it seemed back in the days when drama was a branch of the literature. Exactly.
Great, thank you. And just to put some parameters on where we are then, the performance culture we're talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, but is specifically early modern England for the project you two are talking about?
By and large, yeah. Certainly for the database that we work on, we started off simply for convenience and because of our own interests, looking at around 1580 to 1642 with the closure of theatres, primarily based in London. but that data expanded to think about plays that weren't just in London, they were elsewhere in what we now call Great Britain and across the Isle as well. And more recently, I guess we're thinking also about continental versions of plays, translations, adaptations, thinking really broadly about the variety of evidence available, and also expanding the years, the chronological remit of the project too. So we've currently moved back to 1570, but we've actually got some secret contents pages up there for 1560s and 50s as well, and just a few entries already populated there. And we're thinking forwards as well, thinking about what happens in restoration as well, but that's not quite ready for public release yet. We haven't done enough work there.
Okay, great. So if I turn off my Shakespeare grumpiness for a minute, just in case Shakespeare's a helpful kind of place to root some of this, we're talking about the difference between a play like Hamlet, which feels fairly unlost and present and extant, as opposed to a play like Cardenio, which feels the opposite of those things. But you're also telling us that very quickly, that binary, the moment you start working on lostness, the spectrum as opposed to the binary, something that becomes apparent. I love the idea that the project started out as a process to undo lostness, and then instead ended up challenging the very idea of lostness. And I guess there are certain surviving texts from this period where it's very obvious that we have multiple versions because those multiple versions survive. But even when we have a play which survives in only one version, it's always good to remind ourselves as well that we still lost various iterations, various versions of that particular play, whatever it might be. So there's also a spectrum of survival as well as lostness, if that's right.
Yeah, and it seems funny to think of something like Macbeth or Measure for Measure as a lost play, but both of those we appear to have a later revision, and there's a sort of possible earlier state of it that's kind of partially visible beneath what we've got. But in a sense, the original versions of those are just as lost as Cardenio or The Blind Eats Many a Fly or many of our other favorite lost ones.
Even something like Hamlet, which I hadn't really thought about in this context before. I mean, we don't have the backstage plot for early productions of Hamlet. We don't have the actors' parts. We don't have playbills. There's so much information we don't have about the most famous of early modern plays that exists in 3 substantial extant texts. We don't know much about early performances. We know from the first quarto that it was performed at Cambridge and Oxford, but what circumstances led the company to be performing at the universities at that point in time? When was it performed in London and where? And most intriguingly, I think, what happened off the coast of Africa in 1607? Was it really Shakespeare's Hamlet that was performed on the Red Dragon? And if so, were they reading from text? Were they improvising? I mean, that was a lost performance in important ways. And the thing about lost plays is plays are ephemeral entertainments. They're not novels. So the idea of calling something extant or surviving because we have the text is really anathema to what drama is all about. And trying to recover those performances is something that's really important and interesting.
I love all of that, David. Again, for the benefit of listeners who are new to this, part of me would quite like to leave them in doubt about what the Red Dragon is. I quite like the idea of Hamlet being performed on any other dragon. But can you tell us a bit more about that incident?
An East India Company ship that's moored off the coast of Sierra Leone in 1607, and according to diaries that surfaced in the 19th century, they're of a slightly disputed authenticity. The captain of the ship allowed Shakespeare's Hamlet to be performed, I think, twice, and a Richard II play as well. But what that meant, whether the crew was performing that as some sort of intercultural exchange for the benefit of the locals they're engaging with, whether it was just to relieve boredom on the ship, whether it was actually Shakespeare's plays or just the stories that were entered pop culture already and were being, reprised in some dramatic format. So many unanswered questions. But the broader point is just we know so little about Shakespeare's Hamlet's performance history, and for a play to have lost that, what made it alive, what brought it to life on stage is itself, a great loss.
Great, thank you. And again, just to put give us some context, and either you might want to correct this, but we tend to think that about 1 in 5 plays from this period survive. Again, depending on what we mean by survival, is that about? So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that how unlikely survival is, and that survival is not the normal thing for a play text to do. Is that right?
Well, in our book,
hey,
we have Lost in Literary Culture of Shakespeare's Time, which is an edited collection that David and I and Ross Knudsen have done that's just come out. We actually have a pie chart with the current estimated figures. It's about 1 in 6 survive. And the plays we call the lost plays, the ones that you can at least put a name to and say they once existed, account for maybe half as many again. They're still a minority compared to the much larger number, which you would guess will once have existed to fill both theatres and given what we know about the repertories. So the lost plays are actually among the better documented plays of the period.
Yes.
It was a sort of freaky idea. But yeah, and so there's more out there that we don't know about than that we do. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the point David was making earlier, I suppose. If I had the script to, I don't know, a Batman movie, I wouldn't feel like I had the film. And as you're both saying, we know more about some of the plays that we've lost. Is it all right to tell us then a bit more about what it is you can find out about these lost plays? Matt mentioned Henslow's Diary. I don't know if that's a good starting point, but what sort of things do we know about plays we think of as otherwise things we don't know much about? So can you give us some specific examples of, I guess, the material lives of these plays, what's happening on stage, that kind of thing? Sorry.
Yeah, look, no, I wasn't sure whether Matt wanted to jump in or not. There's plenty of information. The thing that's so interesting to me, I mean, you can get a whole education about what early modern drama was by studying the plays that don't even exist. Because the variety of information that has trickled down to us, except for the plays themselves, is quite rich and varied. So on one hand, there may be textual fragments. These can occasionally be printed. You can have 1 or 2 pages of something. And some people may know, of course, that the first printed edition of 1 Henry IV, only a single page or 2 exists of that. So we got quite lucky. There were subsequent versions printed that did survive, but it does happen. A printed document can survive only in a fragment form. Manuscript fragments, of course, exist too. They can be just a couple of passages or a couple of pages from a play that gives you enough to work on in terms of recurring motifs or tropes, or what we might call theatrograms, to give you a sense of what interested the dramatists of the day and how these ideas repeated across the plays being offered by various companies in London. We may get backstage plots, which give you a sort of a roadmap or an overview of what the action of the play was, the entrances and exits, special effects, which characters were involved and which actors played which roles, but not a fragment of the lines themselves that were spoken. We may get songs, as is suggested to be the case for Cardenio. There's an entire song that seems to survive. You may get eyewitness accounts, very rarely as well. So traveling dignitaries in particular who report being taken to see entertainments and writing brief comments about what they've witnessed. So you get richer details sometimes for these lost plays than you do for the surviving plays.
Great, thank you. Matt, do you want to add?
One of my favourites in that category is Cox of Columpton, which is one of a series of plays seen by Simon Foreman. He writes quite detailed accounts of what happened in that. And that was a tragedy, and it sounds like an absolute riot. It's family members shooting arrows through each other's heads and then doing one another in, and then a spirit in the shape of a bear appears and people go mad, and it sounds absolutely fantastic. And you can enjoy it in Foreman's description, even though you don't have the specific words of the dialogue.
Yeah, great, thank you. So I guess the 2 categories I feel like we've heard about then are a kind of reception history. We hear about what it's like to see some of these plays, which we'd love to hear about with some of the plays we think of as unlost, not lost. We heard from David about the performance context we learn about from the material. And something else that I've taken particularly from David's work, but I'm not sure we've spoken about yet, is do lost plays also tell us something about the kind of storytelling culture, the wider storytelling culture? So we have, for example, biblical stories are more present than we would otherwise think of if we looked at purely plays which survive in text. And we also learned something about the repertory cultures, so the ways in which theatre companies might be competing or collaborating with each other to establish certain kinds of brand identity. Am I right about that?
Well, yes. I'm cautious about company identity and whether there's such a thing as a company style necessarily, but certainly the former point about the richness of genres that are somewhat neglected today is a really important point, I think, because as Matt said before, if only one out of 6 has survived, that's a huge amount of drama that we just didn't think about previously in scholarship. It became invisible, it was hidden in footnotes, often not indexed, often these lost plays, because they didn't necessarily have a title, just became very ephemeral and slippery and just paled into insignificance, and people didn't spend time thinking about them. But it's I think it's madness to base arguments on 1/5 or 1/6 of the corpus. Anything you say is likely to be blown out of the water tomorrow if we pay attention to the other 5/6. Like, it makes no sense to limit ourselves to what we have a full text for. And I think the example I like to give about how an entire genre can change, it comes from my very earliest experiences with lost plays, which is about lost travel plays. And most surviving travel plays are sort of romances like The Tempest, or satires like Eastward Ho, but not very many that are steeped in recent history. I think the Stukely plays, the Alcazar play, that's one of the rare examples. But you start looking at the titles of lost travel plays, and suddenly there's The Conquest of the West Indies, The New World's Tragedy, The Plantation at Virginia. You get a very Amboyna, The Massacre at Amboyna, right? So you get a very different sense of what travel drama could look like if you pay attention to the lost examples that filled out that genre.
Yeah, great. Matt, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, other things you could put in the same categories. I mean, would you bother printing a romance play if the romance that it was dramatising was easily, there's a Chinon of England play, never gets printed, presumably because the prose romance Chinon of England that it's based on is there, it's the book of the play already, so we don't see that in the dramatic records. Lots of siege plays, lots of titles about sieges, where presumably it's all about the special effects and the fight sequences and the guns and the thunder, and they leave something of a trace in the print record. But if you look at the lost plays, look at the example plays in the context lost ones, there were more siege plays there than we see in the printed record. So more examples of that kind of thing, basically.
Okay,
Yeah.
I love the idea that siege plays are not friendly for print, in the sense that I have an image of an actor on a balcony shaking their fist and going, "Leave us alone! Stop besieging us!" And the discursive limits of that particular situation. So I guess some of the things we're thinking about here are the tensions between being a literary scholar who thinks about words and words that survive in whole texts, as opposed to a theatre historian or a literary historian who thinks about the full sweep of evidence, as David's just been asking us to do. Is that right? So there's a tension there in terms of the methods and assumptions and approach to evidence and the definition of what evidence is.
Yeah, look, I understand why you've used the word tension. I'm sort of hesitating over it in as much as I think the best of this kind of work can help us receive a more holistic view of the field, I guess, and sort of encourage all those positions that you've nominated, which are equally important, to sort of cross-fertilize a bit and start talking to each other a bit more and thinking more holistically about what drama was like. And I think one good example of that is this. I like the siege example, the siege plays, but thinking about the Queen's Men and thinking about the famous victories of Henry V, and the way there's an entire scene in that play consisting of that stage direction for the battle to enter, right? There's no dialogue. And that was the most important scene in that play, because only the Queen's Men, with their scale, their cast, and their ability to choreograph elaborate battle scenes, could pull off some. That was probably the scene you would go to see, pay to see. And all we have is a stage direction, right? And so if you're not paying attention to the performance side of things, you've missed what is arguably the heart of that play. And if you were to do authorship attribution, stylistic analysis, looking at the words in that play, trying to work out who the author was, there's very clearly a style there, but very obviously a Queen's Men play because of that kind of a scene. But that 3 or 4 word stage direction is going to be insignificant if you're comparing statistics, word for word. It's not going to produce an authorial profile. But any theatre historian worth their salt is going to say that that play had to be a Queen's Men play. So there's something really interesting, there's something much more productive about imagining the performance side of things and thinking about why a company had a play, rather than being restricted to just theatre history or literary studies or any one of those individual camps, I suppose.
Right, and it's by sticking to those camps we restrict the evidence, the full reach of evidence we could otherwise have.
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the great exciting things about this is just, it's a very romantic poet, capital R, sort of sense of the wonder of the everyday and sort of returning with fresh eyes to things and sort of, that childlike awe of looking at the drama again for the first time and sort of really rethinking first principles, I suppose.
Great. Matt's point about looking at the evidence of lost plays telling us that in fact, it was David's point, I beg your pardon, but the presence of recent history on the stage that we learn about when we look at lost travel plays, for example. This is an unlost play, so apologies, but I always love the adjective late in the play, the Late Lancashire Witches, in the sense of, you would not believe what's just happened in Lancashire. And the prologue, which says, we've written this play in a huge hurry because Corantos have been banned, newspapers have been banned, and we want you, the audience, to judge whether these people who are on trial right now in London, whether or not they're witches. That, for me, that feels like a really exciting glimpse into a liveness of storytelling, which we see maybe in Massacre of Paris, which is an older event, but still fairly recent, but that otherwise we don't really see. And you're telling us we see that in the Lost Plays evidence.
Some of the most famous Lost Plays, Keep the Widow Waking, which was I would count as totally hilarious dramatisation of sort of contemporary abduction, basically, of this unfortunate widow. We don't have the play, we have quite a detailed description of it in the legal action that resulted afterwards. The Old Joinery of Aldgate, similar thing, quite astonishingly, that putting a contemporary woman's marriage troubles on the stage, very topically, making fun of, I think there's a cleric associated with St. Paul's is one of her suitors, and he's actually the guy who complains, says, you can't make a play about this. So yes, there was clearly a whole very topical aspect of the theatre, which again is poorly represented, as you say, Late Lancashire, which has been a good example of one where we do have a text for one of those. Yeah.
And I wonder if those sorts of plays are especially unlikely to end up in print. That could be wrong, but is there something about the liveness of their story in conjunction with the liveness of this performance medium, which means, and perhaps not just liveness, but the controversy of their story, which makes it less likely to get printed? I don't know.
That sounds a good bet.
Yeah. Look, there's a whole sort of intuitive reasons that are quite compelling for why certain plays might have been, lost, or and why they may have been printed and survived. But a lot of that logic doesn't bear close scrutiny. We find counterexamples to almost every heuristic you want to establish. The big point, I guess, that we've come across is that there is no real rhyme or reason. You can't bank on it. You can't say this kind of play is a sure contender to have been lost, because you'll find examples that do survive, or you'll find examples that were lost. And it's just, it's once we start trying to assume too much, we find ourselves on really unsteady ground.
Okay. Is it worth turning the question around and thinking about what makes survival, and particularly print survival, more likely? I'm thinking about things like the big play collections of people like Beaumont and Fletcher, Shakespeare, Lilly to a lesser extent, Johnson. Is there a kind of authorial bias to play survival, or are there other ways in which we can talk about reasons that plays might survive in print?
Well, Matt's just written a very nice chapter about this for our book, so I'll let him answer this question.
It's funny you should mention the example of Shakespeare First Folio, because what that does is it sucks a load of Shakespeare comedies into print for the first time. His histories and tragedies, it adds, I think, one or two histories, it about doubles numbers of tragedies in print, but it sucks in a whole load of comedies which otherwise might have had trouble forcing their way into the print marketplace, would be the guess. So there's an interesting example. You get other clusters of plays when a theatre company, the old idea that the theatre company runs into trouble and sells off its plays to print, which obviously is contested, is still, I think, quite useful for looking at those clusters of plays from associated with a particular company that appear in print. That might be a factor. And as you say, named authors. I mean, Johnson's Mortimer His Fall is one of the very few half plays to get printed. Almost everything that makes its way into print is a complete play text from beginning to end, whereas in other forms we have lots of survival in fragments, quoted speeches and things. Johnson's Mortimer His Fall, which is a half-finished play that comes out for Johnson completists in a complete Johnson, is one of the few examples of a half play making it into print. So yeah, exactly. Kind of what you said there, Andy. In particular, authorship as a quite a powerful category. Yeah.
And is there a distinction to be made within that category between, or by the way, feel free for this to be a big no, but between authors who are actively moulding their authorial output in print, like Ben Jonson, who seems to be actively less engaged in his earlier work, for example, as against someone like Shakespeare, whose relationship with print is complicated and controversial, but doesn't seem to be having quite such a curatorial role in his output?
I would say there's something in that, but it's not necessarily what we expect. I mean, the standard line is that Jonson is much more involved in printing his own work than most other dramatists of the day are. Not so much that he ignores the earliest work as that he rejects the collaboratively authored work to the point where he'll actually overwrite the scenes that his collaborators contributed to a play to make it more wholly Johnsonian and therefore worthy of inclusion in his own folio. And that this is supposedly the model that then leads to the survival of Shakespeare's plays because authorship becomes the organising principle. And of course, there's lots of contested work around that with the Pavia quartos printed in 16, 18, 19 as a false folio and things like that. So the limits of authorship as a legitimate organising category are something that book historians in particular have been doing some wonderful work around. But if we pause and think about the 1647 folio for a moment, the one commonly referred to as the Beaumont and Fletcher folio, where we would expect that massive amount of plays to survive purely because of, well, Fletcher's organisation principle, I suppose, because Beaumont only contributes a handful to that large collaboration. But really, there's so much Massenger in there and Shirley in there as well. So in what sense is authorship, even if Beaumont and Fletcher's names are on the title page, in what sense is authorship taken seriously as a category? And how did Beaumont and Fletcher's authorship account for the survival of Massenger and Shirley plays in that mix? It's a very odd project that summons the spectre of authorship at the same time as it's really quite playing fast and loose with it.
So is it demonstrating authorship as a marketing strategy rather than a creative or organizational one? Is that right?
Potentially, or maybe they just, they get enough to get you into the shop to have a look at the book, and then they don't care too much about accuracy thereafter, right? It's the headline.
Thank you. We're heading towards the end of our conversation. Is there anything in particular that you would have liked me to have asked you about, or you'd like to say more about in relation to lost plays? That's a big, wide open question.
I'll just say that it's surprised me how much working on lost plays is relevant right now, methodologically, and in terms of argumentation, simply because it forces us to rethink everything we take for granted. And I'm sure I'm not alone down here in the end of the earth in Australia about thinking this at the moment, but we were all very isolated, and things we took for granted, like going to the shops, going to the park, going to work, are all suddenly off the cards. And the way we interact with people, the way we do our daily business, balancing work and family life and home life, is everything that has to be rethought. And it's interesting for me because this echoes what we're doing professionally as well when working on lost plays. Where we've none of us been trained as scholars of lost plays, we've been trained as early modernists, and we work with texts, and suddenly that's all gone, and we look at texts with fresh eyes, and we don't take things for granted. And more than that, you look at the arguments that we've made in the past and that our colleagues have made, and suddenly become sharply aware of how many assumptions are built in there, how contingent all those arguments are, and sometimes how overstated or overconfident they are, given the fragility of the material we now know they're working with. So it's almost a Cartesian moment of sort of too much doubt, I guess, and trying to re-establish what it is that we can say confidently. But I'm very much feeling that at the moment, just the world around us. So it's interesting seeing that nexus between our research and real life.
Sure. Matt?
And perhaps I could add to that, one of the things that I've loved about working on Lost Plays since I started is that there has been collaboration. The Lost Plays database as a site for kind of exchanging ideas, and periodically we've discovered something. We've had emails going around the planet through the time zones. I mean, David and I worked together for some years before we ever actually met in real life. So in some ways that I think that's been coming up in these a bit lit podcasts already has been how you work differently when you are apart, and in a sense that's been something we've been doing already. So it's yes, it's nice.
Yeah, it's a project which has been leading the way forward as to how to have kind of non-IRL collaborations, how to have digital forms of collaboration. And as you both say, that's very much where we're all at now, playing catch up with you guys. I forget if I warned you about this, but we're ending these videos by asking our contributors what the word literature means to them, whether it's a helpful or an unhelpful term, whether it's part of their professional or personal lexicon. And with the subject of lost texts so kind of prevalent in this conversation, I'm particularly keen to ask you that question. So I'm sorry if I'm launching this on you, but yeah, is that a helpful word? Is it a word that is useful to you? I'll let you decide who goes first.
Well, I thought we were ending with bad puns, so I'm very disappointed.
Say that again.
I thought we were ending with bad puns, so
Oh,
I'm very disappointed.
I'm sure we'll get to those eventually. They happen by mistake.
Well, for me, I mean, I'm increasingly feeling like a dinosaur. My understanding of what I was doing when I started a university degree was that this was about English language and literature, the two going together to form the story of possibly even our great culture. They may have used that phrase. I can't quite remember. And week one of the first term, we were doing Matthew Arnold. We were doing literature and the best culture and anarchy and the best that has been thought and known in the world. So I love that quotation. Very much a kind of old school idea of literature as this improving, morally worthy thing. And I guess partly using the tools that I've learned while studying it, I've started to unpick that. So although literature is a much more elastic category, it is basically what we do is cultural studies, really, which for a long time was a dirty word. And but it still gives pleasure. That's the thing. I would very much defend that this stuff gives pleasure in the reading, and even in the case of the lost plays, in the looking at the lost play as a thing, what we can see of it. So I've moved away from my Arnoldian roots, but yeah, would still celebrate it as an idea.
David.
I think for me, I mean, the lost plays that we focus primarily on have been those that have originated in London and the companies who are operating, in repertories essentially. So there's a commercial logic underpinning their selection of plays for performances and the way these plays interact with each other across theatres in London. And so looking at lost plays and, increasing that pool of plays that we know are performed by fivefold, sixfold, has a couple of really interesting effects for me in terms of what literature is. And if we take Shakespeare again as that starting point, because as you suggested before, occasionally he can be helpful. But he was not just a playwright, of course, not just an actor, but also a shareholder in his company. He was a businessman, and he was writing to get money, and he wanted people coming into his theatres. And we start seeing the extent of the marketplace that he was competing in for audience patronage. We start realizing that, I'm not telling this against Shakespeare. In fact, I think it sharpens his achievement that he can produce wonderful plays as well as trying to make money, basically. So it demystifies literature to some extent. It shows us, the everyday reality of producing for commercial purposes. It also decenters Shakespeare somewhat, and you realize what a fraction his 40 or so plays are of the total output from that period, and just how rich and vibrant that theatrical culture was, and how much more there is to be appreciated out there.
That was great. Thank you very much. I can't think of a pun, so if either of you can think of one, feel free to get one quickly before we wrap up. But it's been really exciting being asked to think about literature from this period, which, because of people like Shakespeare, we often feel we know very well, including people who wouldn't describe themselves as specialists of literature, nevertheless feel that Shakespeare is someone who is culturally and self-evidently omnipresent. It's really exciting to hear about the sheer scale of work that's happening around him and what we can recover and learn about from plays we think of as lost, and how they would have been performed, how they would have been seen on stage, the kinds of alternative storytelling traditions they were offering to us. So yeah, thank you very much, both of you. I still can't think of a pun. It's like a pun emergency that's occurring at the end of this this video. We'll come back and we'll do a sequel in the future, which is just a succession of terrible puns. How's that?
Sounds like a plan.
Thank you very much, both of you.
Yeah, very nice to see you.